So Rick, thanks for being here with me today. Really appreciate your time and coming to talk to us about vulnerable adults and how we live into safe sanctuaries in serving vulnerable adults.
Well, thank you, Melanie. It's a pleasure to be here and to discuss this important topic.
Welcome. So I have a few questions for you. The first is, help us define a vulnerable adult.
Not as easy as it sounds. It's like, I know it when I see it, but trying to define it can be cumbersome, to say the least. Vulnerable adults can be older adults, both men and women. They may be persons who live alone, isolated. Maybe there's some mild cognitive impairment or some other frailty or physical functioning that keeps them from being as active as they once were. They may have caregivers who watch over them and care for them and care for their needs. And so in that sense, they could be described as a vulnerable adult. But it just isn't the elderly. It just isn't older persons who are vulnerable adults. I think we have adults of all ages who may have their own, be persons with disabilities. Could be persons that have some mental disability or physical disability that that person also becomes vulnerable, even though we think, oh, only older adults are vulnerable. But adults of all ages can be vulnerable. And of course, adults who work with young people can also be vulnerable.
Absolutely.
And they have to be very concerned and careful with how they go about their ministry or how they relate to young people. So in describing who are vulnerable adults, they can be adults of all ages, and oftentimes it depends upon the setting in which they find themselves or the context in which they live, or perhaps their own physical well-being. Okay?
Great. That really clears up a lot of questions that people have. Thank you, Rick. So we have another question. So often we think of safe sanctuary, when we think of safe sanctuaries, we only think about children and youth. What should we take into consideration when serving vulnerable adults?
I think first and foremost would be the whole area of elder abuse when we're thinking about safe sanctuaries. And I say that for a variety of reasons. One, the reality that elder abuse is growing in terms of numbers, and in part simply because we are an aging population. So there are more older adults. And when you think just about the boomer generation, which is aging, with 78 million boomers who are in their 50s and 60s, and of course, as of January 1 of 2016, the leading edge boomers began turning 70.
Wow.
So we're thinking about a population of people that in reality help set the tone for vulnerability, just because there's so many of adults and older adults. So when we think about elder abuse, we're thinking about people who are living alone. We're thinking about oftentimes forgotten by their churches, their congregations. I mean, they may be people who used to worship on a regular basis on Sunday mornings or Wednesday nights or Bible study during the week, and yet now, because of a variety of problems, whether it's transportation issues, whether it's their own mild cognitive impairment or physical functioning, impacts their lives that they're not able to participate fully in the life of a congregation. And sometimes they're forgotten. They're out of sight, out of mind. And as a result of that, they are left maybe to fend for themselves. And we may find that now suddenly we see this person who we haven't seen before, and there's a new friend. And the new friend could, in fact, be a person who plans to take advantage of this older person. So I think elder abuse is going to be a growing issue within our communities as a result of our aging population. One of the things that I would like to say is that the U.S. Census Bureau indicates that by 2030, the percentage of people 65 years of age and over in the United States will be 21%.
Wow.
Yes, but the U.S. Census Bureau also says children and youth under 18 will be 21%. So for the very first time in our history, we will have as many, percentage-wise, the same number of older adults as we do children and youth. And most congregations, nor community, are properly prepared or fully equipped to deal with such an aging society. I mean, the demographics are just startling. And as a result of that, because there are more older persons, there is the more likelihood and opportunity to take advantage of persons in need.
Absolutely.
Because as we grow older, we find ourselves, maybe 1 out of 2 people who are 85 years of age and over have dementia issues, dementia concerns. So in all likelihood, we just are ripe for the picking, if you will, in terms of elder abuse as we age.
Which means that the church has to be more knowledgeable and more caring for.
And more intentional. Congregations have to become much more intentional in their ministry. By, with, and for older persons that we always say. I mean, things such as making certain that folks who work with older persons have CPR training or first aid training. That in terms of visitation, that there are teams of 2 people that go, and not just one person who would actually go and visit someone, but that we have teams that do so. And this is for the protection, not only of the person who they're visiting, but for the folks who are doing the visiting. So it protects everyone. And congregations need to be aware that as a growing concern with our aging population, that training, reference checking, all of these things need to be a part of their everyday ministry with volunteers and with staff. So, you know, not the staff, but the volunteers who are engaging in ministry.
Right. And it sounds like we have to remember that it's not just about young people, it's about vulnerable adults. We need to put that training together.
Exactly.
Because the things that you were saying are very similar to when we're thinking about training and supervision for young people.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thanks, Rick.
Really, the congregation, churches need to be aware of all ages.
Absolutely.
I mean, you know, children, youth, young adults, as well as their middle-age adults and older adults as well.
Absolutely. Thanks, Rick. So, why is it important to establish guidelines that protect vulnerable adults? Because a lot of times when we establish our Safe Sanctuaries guidelines, we are really looking at young people. We may say vulnerable adults, but a lot of times we don't know what are those little idiosyncrasies that happen with older adults.
Well, I think having guidelines are important for the protection, as I said a moment ago, for the protection of both those who are engaged in ministry as well as those who are receiving the ministry. And having guidelines that just protects everyone. And protection is key in our congregations and our communities today. Guidelines help not only for the safety of all, but it also helps guide us in our ministry, what we can and cannot engage in, what we can do and cannot do. As I said, in terms of having the background checks, reference checks for all staff, having at least 2 people who engage in visitation. I think having things such as parish nurse ministries.
Yes.
And that's certainly, parish nurse ministries are faith community health ministries, not just for older adults. That covers intergenerational, really, children and youth and adults of all ages, really. Having those ministries, visitation ministries and transportation ministries that can, again, cross age barriers. We're not just talking about those vulnerable adults, we're talking about all ages and stages of life that can benefit from having the guidelines and having some specific ministries that would help persons.
Well, Rick, thank you so much for being with me here today to talk about Safe Sanctuaries and how we make sure that vulnerable adults are protected in our congregations and communities.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me. This is an important topic, and I'm glad to be a part of it. Thank you.
You're a blessing to the church, Rick.
So are you, Melanie. Thank you.